Hello and welcome to EU and Me, the Arbury Road Podcast. My name's Katrin. I'm an editor at Arbury Road and a PhD student in politics. Before we start, I'd just like to remind you that Arbury Road is run by volunteers. So if you enjoy this podcast, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. And if you're able to support us with a monthly donation, for Christmas, we're running a half price offer of €350 a month, the price of a good coffee in Northern Europe. And for students, €190, the price of a coffee in Central Europe, maybe. So you'll find these offers on our website, arburyroad.eu, or in the video description if you're watching this on YouTube. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Alessandro Ceccarelli on the HIV response and LGBT-phobia in Europe. Alessandro is an affiliated scholar at the University of Cambridge and is a member of the steering committee of Fast Track Cardiff and Vale, a fast track city initiative that's working to achieve the UNAIDS targets of zero new HIV transmissions and zero stigma associated with HIV. This week is HIV Testing Week in Wales, and next Wednesday, the 1st of December, is HIV Awareness Day. So this is a timely conversation and of course, an important one. Welcome, Alessandro.
Hi, thank you very much for this. Hi.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work that Fast Track does?
Yeah, sure. So yes, my name is Alessandro Ceccarelli. I'm currently based in Wales, and I'm part of this group of volunteers that run the Fast Track Cardiff and Vale. I think my role within the group is very much supporting the communication and stakeholder engagement aspect of the work. But because it's a volunteer-led group, there's pretty much various things to do, and people volunteer to do bits and pieces from, meeting people, delivering talks, organizing events, or editing videos. So there's a bit of running around, but the common element is that we are all together to try to meet the target, the goal of zero new HIV infections by 2030, but also to tackle and fight stigma and amplify and promote HIV testing, and of course collect data or support researchers to collect data in Wales. So yes, that's pretty much our work in Cardiff and Vale.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you work toward improving the HIV response, I guess, and I wonder, thinking about the whole continent. I know you're focused in Wales, but if you comment on Europe, how does the HIV response vary across the continent? I mean, are there some countries that are setting a good standard that we can look to, or can we identify any particularly problematic countries? And given that we're sort of speaking on the general theme, what are the implications of the HIV response for LGBT people in Europe?
It's a quite complex picture, really, quite complex landscape in Europe. We should also distinguish between the European Union as such and the members of the European Union and the European region as defined by the WHO. So if you look at the first one, European Union, you could see some positive trends, although there is a degree of stagnation in different countries. Somehow the figures are quite, positive to an extent. While we look at the European region, however, the figures are not quite good. And this is a bit concerning, especially if you consider that we come from the experience of COVID-19. You may expect us to have learned a lesson there, but no, unfortunately, there is an increase in an undiagnosed HIV, but there's also an increase of late diagnosis of HIV infections in the European region, in particular in the eastern region, which is quite concerning if people get an HIV diagnosis when it's in a late stage. Means that there is some implications for treatments. So something that is particularly urgent in the European region is to reconsider and look at the how we can improve and how can we make a priority earlier diagnosis in Europe. That goes through testing, which would be to make testing easier or more available in different forms, but also diversify testings, giving people different options, and that is not necessarily available across Europe in a uniform way. Other issues that are concern HIV right now in Europe is well, we want to protect the progress done so far, and we know that testing is not keeping up with new transmissions of HIV. So that's an aspect to reinforce. But there's also the issues of prevention and treatment in certain regions, in certain areas of the European region, which is quite problematic because of lack of funding. So there is a sort of deprioritization of HIV campaigns and dedicated funding for testing, prevention, and treatment, which include also PrEP and ERT availability. Another issue that is connected to HIV in Europe is how we target our audience, how we engage the community to get tested. And we have seen in the past couple of years that there is an increase of late diagnosis in particular in certain groups, for instance, older generations or people that are above 50-year-old, which is quite indicative of how we are communicating the message around HIV in Europe, and really rethinking our strategy around engagement in populations. You ask a bit about the LGBT community, and till an extent, there are intersectional issues of HIV, in particular concerning certain groups within the LGBTQ+ community. Historically, gay men or bisexual men have been particularly engaged in this type of narrative, but also campaigns. But this is definitely an issue that should be kind of expanded beyond the LGBTQ+ umbrella. In particular, if you look, for instance, at groups such as sex workers, if you look at heterosexual people in Eastern Europe, and as I mentioned before, older generations of 50+. So although there are implications that are particularly relevant for the LGBT group, it's quite useful to go beyond the type of lens, if you wish. And although particularly relevant for the LGBT community is the issue of stigma, that perhaps is one of the contributing factors to this late diagnosis that we are seeing now around, what is HIV, then the stigma attached to it, in particular towards LGBT people. And this is certainly another urgent area or a priority area, the fight against stigma. That is mostly done through, education, knowledge, but also by showing positive and empowering champions and role models within a variety of communities and diverse communities.
Yeah, and I guess particularly when we're sitting here in the middle of, still in the middle of a pandemic, right?
Exactly.
Then I can see how, there's no stigma associated with, with getting COVID-19, right? And so it's
you would hope for
all of the funding and energy that has gone into fighting this disease, which has killed far few people than HIV, right? It's I don't know. It makes clear that there's something about the community that is affected by HIV that is very different in people's eyes, right?
Indeed, and that's why I mentioned before, it's important that despite the focus on COVID-19 right now, we should really not lose track of the progress, or we should really keep protecting the progress that we have made over the past decade, and so prioritize HIV testing and treatment. It should really be a priority.
And if anything, learn from our experience that if you throw a whole lot of funding and proactive testing at a disease or a virus, then it works, right? Yeah. Thinking more broadly about the other themes that we wanted to discuss today, LGBT-phobia is wider than just HIV stigma, right? And I think we wanted to talk about this because we've seen a lot of concerning expressions of LGBT-phobia in Europe just this year. Earlier in the year, a number of Polish local authorities declared themselves LGBT-free, banning pride marches and LGBT events. Hungary banned LGBT content in schools and media, which, as you've spoken about, is so important for reducing stigma, kind of emulating the Russian sort of so-called gay propaganda law from 2013. And just earlier this month, you spoke to my colleague, Georgia, about the Italian Senate rejecting a bill that would have protected LGBT people from discrimination and violence. So we've seen these really worrying expressions of LGBT phobia, but we've also seen significant backlash to those events and defense of LGBT equality. So we've seen some positive progress too. In September this year, Switzerland approved same-sex marriage by referendum, and that was with a 2/3 majority. So that's fantastic to see. So we kind of there seem to be movements in both directions, right? And it's hard to know. So my question to you really is, putting this all in context, thinking about progress over the last 10 years or last 5 years or so, is LGBT phobia becoming worse in Europe, or are we seeing uneven progress across different countries, different regions? I mean, what's your assessment of LGBT phobia across Europe today?
Well, I think there's a bit of both, in the sense that it's definitely quite uneven, and we have data from different countries that can really help us to understand what is happening. Although something that I mentioned to Georgia a few weeks ago was the issues of lack of data around all various issues, but we do have still quite a lot of quantitative or qualitative evidence that can help us to understand what's going on. And there is definitely an uneven picture and issues, but there is an overall rise in terms of abuse or hate speech against LGBT people in Europe. There it comes, and it's visible in different forms and on different platforms. Sometimes it comes from how you would say the media, or you could read something on the press. Sometimes it comes from official sources, which is particularly concerning. We should kind of ask this question through, again, an intersectional lens. So not just looking at lesbians or gay men or bisexual men or trans people, but looking at an intersectional picture of it. For instance, considering age in this, what about younger LGBT people? What's their experience? And that's where really we see how disproportionately affected these communities are, and how progress is, if it's not stagnating, is sometimes regressing. There are some exceptions, of course, like countries such as Malta that are particularly progressive and inclusive in terms of policies and practices. But the overall trend is that there are some significant issues and perhaps even regression. I was mentioning younger people. The issues of homelessness is quite significant for LGBT youth in Europe, and there's plenty of data and surveys available to kind of break that down. So yes, using this intersectional lens can help us to understand what about access to shelter and food for LGBT people, why they're so disproportionately affected by this, and that's why the picture really emerged. There's of course the issue of some countries or some governments or political party using a propaganda that is clearly against certain groups within the LGBT community, kind of to empower their authoritarian or nationalistic propaganda, and kind of to isolate or marginalize LGBT people, which is concerning, at least. But it's more than that. It's actually quite a significant problem, and quite a priority area of work. But as I say, it's not quite even. It's quite diverse, and in particular in the eastern region of Europe, but not exclusively there. You mentioned Italy, for instance, with this, unfortunately, what happened with the ZAN bill, which was rejected. So we don't need to look too much east to see to find out certain type of behaviors or phenomenon. It's also quite concerning what is currently happening across Europe for the trans and non-binary community within the LGBT umbrella. And I would say that that's perhaps one of the groups that is mostly under certain type of, they experience certain type of discriminations or attacks. And of course, there's a lot of aspects within that narrative. There's a side that concerns legal gender recognition that is somehow undermined, or there's not much progress in that respect. There's a narrative that concerns self-determination, and again, not much progress done in Europe besides a few countries. And particularly relevant is for the younger generation, young adults, and minors in terms of self-determination and gender recognition. So there's, again, another aspect of the community that is not really progressing much. And as I mentioned before, the issues of hate speech, but this can be kind of expanded to kind of look through this intersectional lens and look in particular certain communities, for instance, migrants or minority ethnic groups, or asylum seekers and refugees that are, let's say, once again, disproportionately affected because of their characteristics, and because European countries are really not investing much in terms of new policies and legislations and practices, I would say, because we do see something changing in the books and in terms of policies in certain countries, but that does not mean that it's necessarily reflected in the practice or in real changes in terms of experiences of LGBT people. As I say, there are some countries that are particularly progressive, for instance, Malta, again, on the area of asylum seekers and refugees, but still, I would say that the picture, we should not perhaps take for granted certain type of achievements of progress that the LGBT community attained over the past decade.
I mean, you've certainly painted a picture of there has been some regression. It's not, I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell whether things are getting better or worse in the world because of the way that we consume media, but it's quite clear that, as you say, things are either stagnating or even regressing. But you've just spoken about how there are some government policies, but they're not maybe sort of leading to practical improvements. I wonder if you could, maybe using examples from Malta or whatever what do you see as ways that we can make practical improvements? What are the most important levers for fighting LGBT-phobia and actually improving the life experiences of these different communities that you've spoken about? Non-government organizations do a lot of work, but I'm also thinking about what can businesses do, what can governments do? I mean, what do you see as the most important levers and the challenges?
I'd say that it is important for governments to progress, to change their policies, their legislations, but I think that the real strength of LGBT advocacy and activism is around grassroots movements and community groups and volunteers, and perhaps even the charity sector to an extent, which is really where change can happen in many countries, even where progress is stagnating at the moment. So I'd say funding on helping these community groups, these grassroots movements, is particularly important for governments or for the EU in general, making sure that the money arrives to the right places. And if you have this kind of movements from that level, from a local level, you can really involve various people, you can connect. So something that is particularly important is, as you mentioned, this staff network within organizations like LGBT staff networks. They really help the experiences of people within a company, an organization, or a group. However, I think even more important is to try to connect the dots between these community groups, these activists, these realities and these groups that are a bit more isolated. But once you connect them, it's really a powerful resource and a platform for change that is perhaps even more effective than a flashy change in policy sometimes, although we need changes in policy in certain countries of Europe as well. I'd say that, so yes, running LGBT staff network is definitely helpful, and people can do it, and they can just ask themselves, do I have that in my workplace? How can we set that one up? But there's also the fact that these community groups, this grassroots movement, rely heavily on LGBT people. Basically, you're asking, not you, as in people we are asking people who are discriminated against to identify the issue and solve the issues at the same time, which is a lot of work. So it's very important that we prioritize also the mental health and physical health and overall well-being of these volunteers and community groups, because they may risk the burnout, and it's something that, it's not good for people, that's also not good for change, because it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's a long-term plan, really, to really make changes. So yes, definitely networks help, and local forum, like regional forums, can also help among these little communities and local communities. It really empowers them and can really change things. But I also would say that it's really important for governments to start spelling out what they want to do and how they want to do it, but most important, what resources they're going to put into their plans. Because you may have, for instance, the European Union coming up with a certain strategy for equality and LGBT issues, or you can have Italy with a ZAN bill. They're all excellent plans. Well, they can be improved always, but they come from a good place, and they can really change things for people, but they need to be coupled with funding, with resources, and governments in general should really be ready to invest and to invest resources into these plans. Otherwise, they're just wish lists that don't really transform into an actual change for people. I'd say that in terms of main challenges, we should really understand what are the communities that are mostly affected right now at this point in time. You can only do it if you have proper data collection, but just by looking at what's happening around us and asking to the communities to tell us what's going on, we know that minority ethnic groups are in a particular disadvantaged position right now within the LGBT umbrella. And we know that trans and non-binary are also in that position. Young people and people that are at risk of homelessness, or that are experiencing homelessness within the LGBT umbrella, perhaps these are the groups that really need that level of support, and we should really invest in that type of resources to understand the issues and provide support and change in those areas. So those are the main challenges right now for me.
And certainly data collection is something where governments
Indeed.
have both the capacity and the ability to do that, right? So not just channeling funds to, as you say, grassroots organizations to help them do things, but also giving them the tools to kind of know where the problems really are, right? You've already mentioned the European Union as another potential actor. I suppose either as a funder for these types of groups, or I wonder what the other types of roles for the European Union are. I'm thinking about what happened this year with the European Parliament's response to the LGBT-free zones in Poland.
Yes.
This kind of symbolic gesture of declaring Europe an LGBTIQ freedom zone, but also coupled with the threat to withhold funding from those localities that had adopted the LGBT-free resolutions. And we have seen quite a number of those local authorities withdraw those decisions or those measures. So in a way, it sort of seems like that strategy worked, but the way that I see it is, okay, it might have been effective, but it was a really reactive measure. What's happened is the EU has prevented discriminatory things from happening. It's maybe prevented the situation from getting worse formally in those places, but it doesn't actually act to improve LGBT equality and inclusion.
Indeed.
So I wonder, sort of beyond or in addition to making funds available for grassroots organisations, which surely the EU has a role to play there. Are there any other sort of more proactive things that the European Union could be doing, or is in a better place to be doing than national governments, perhaps?
I think so. So just to comment on the first part of what you were saying, it's very interesting, the reactions or the tools that the European Union has to kind of face certain type of LGBTQ phobia or discriminatory episodes. And I would say that something that we need to keep in mind, I think we need to remember that the governments or governments in general do not equal all people in country. So in the case of Hungary, that does not reflect necessarily the needs and the experiences and the issues of people. So when we devise a strategy or we have a plan, we should also keep in mind that how to balance our response or support towards those countries, how to sort of a hard line or like a punishment approach towards a government may in fact have a significant impact on people, and threatening for, mentioning, for instance, cut to funding could have certain type of implications for communities that need help. So there's this type of trying to juggle and balance to what extent you keep the conversation going and help the country, so you can, in a way, still reach out and help people. In particular, if you consider the importance of movement of people within the European Union, and also allocation of funding, if and when the European Union or the various groups and organizations identify respect towards the equality principle and comply with the European Union law. I'd say that another element to consider is where the acceptance of LGBTQ people overall is going up or down. And we know that at least in 9 member states, the acceptance is going down. And that means that perhaps we should have a closer look at what's happening in those countries. And this is something that the LGBTIQ equality strategy of the European Union for the next 4 years is looking into. So they have a plan, and which is, as mentioned before, it's always good to have a plan and to publish a plan of actions, and they do, and they want to tackle discrimination, they want to ensure people's safety, they want to build an inclusive societies and be leaders in the world, so globally being champions of LGBTIQ rights. How they're gonna do it, I'm not 100% sure how they're gonna monitor the progress and how they're gonna implement all the suggested strategy. But the strategy is really good, at least on paper. And they have, as I said before, the power of empower other groups and other countries through funding, although that comes with the caveat of to what extent you can cut it down in response to non-compliance to EU law. And yes, there's also the technical assistance and the methodological support to design and implement new policies and regulations, but also exercises such as data collection within countries. This is certainly something that the European Union should be able to provide to begin with, and I think that would be a really good starting point just to understand what's going on.
And just circling back to to where we started, we talked about not only for the LGBT community, but for everyone, right? That access to testing for HIV and early intervention was something that governments could be doing. I mean, is that a space where the EU should be showing more leadership too?
Potentially, yes. There is. So the problem is that there is out there, for instance, standardized approach to data collection within local dimensions or regions or cities, or so it's. If that is lacking, the level of standardization is difficult really to target an area over the other. So we can have a broader picture, which is again a good starting point. But really, as I mentioned before, for the HIV. This week is also, if I'm not mistaken, European HIV testing week, although there's various testing week happening in different countries with different names, but the purpose is the same, which is really to amplify the message and improve access to testing. And I think, so testing, treatment, and fighting stigma are really should be top priorities. And I'm 100% sure the European Union can also help with that.
It seems also this issue of the availability of good data and improving data collection is something that is coming up in so many different issues that the European Union is sort of trying to address. This week we'll be publishing an article about the EU's proposed resolution to address gender-related violence, and a big issue there as well is just lack of data. So we know it's bad, but we don't really know how bad and among what sort of communities we should be targeting. So it seems like this is something that's incredibly important, and where the EU has real strengths as well.
Indeed. But yeah, there's multiple venues there. And I do believe that the resources are there. It's just a matter of prioritizing. I understand that with COVID-19, the focus may have shifted a bit, but we can't really lose track of what we are doing. And
and take it as a positive message too. Is there anything else that you wanted to add for our listeners today before we go?
One more thing, as it's HIV testing week in different parts of Europe, get tested. Find where you can get an affordable and easily accessible venue that is also confidential or secure for yourself, where you feel comfortable and safe, and get tested, because that is very important. That's how we stop new HIV transmissions by 2030. So get tested.
Yes, thank you for that message. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Just to remind you, if you like this podcast, please like it, share it. If you can't afford to support us, then sharing our content is the best thing you can do to help Arbury Road grow. Thanks very much. See you later. Thank you, Alessandra, as well.
Thank you very much. Take care.